Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm really delighted to be hosting this event this evening, a book launch for the very excellent Exploring Parliament. My name's Hannah White, and I'm the director of the Institute for Government, and I played almost no part in the production of this book, but I'm really delighted to see so many people here who played much more significant and important roles. So we're going to run this event for about an hour, after which there will be a drinks reception for those of you who are here in person. Sorry to those online, you'll have to pour your own drinks. And the way we're going to run it, we're going to have a few words to kick off from the wonderful editors of this book, Christina Leston-Bandera, Alex Meakin and Louise Thompson. And then we're going to have two panels. So we have our first panel here already poised on the stage. And they are each going to say a few words drawing on the chapters that they produced for the book. And then we'll have an opportunity for audience questions to this panel. And I have a Slido on my iPad, so I'll be able to take online questions as well as questions in the room. Then this panel will seamlessly depart the stage, and the new panel will join me on the stage, and we will have a second panel with the same model. So brief remarks, followed by questions from the audience. I hope that sounds okay for everyone, and I would like to invite the editors to the stage.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you. And don't worry, we won't be too long.
Oh.
Just to say thank you very much, really, for everyone to attend. It's really nice to see everyone here, so many friends, so many contributors to the book, but also people interested in Parliament. And obviously, hello to everyone also online. It's really, really good to be with everyone just to celebrate the book. It took a long time, but I think it's worth it. It's really nice to celebrate it. When the book came out last month, Alex, Louise and I thought very briefly about maybe doing a launch of the book, and then very quickly we thought, no, we just don't have the time or capacity to do it, particularly with not being in London, being in north of England. It would have been, it would have been very difficult for us to do it. So you can imagine our delight when Rebecca McKee and Hannah White got in touch with us and said they would actually offer to do us a launch free of charge, which is really, really generous of the Institute for Government. And we say, obviously, yes, please. So thank you so much for, to Hannah, to Rebecca, to Susanna, who's probably the most efficient person I know on earth, for everyone for organising this brilliant launch. And of course, after our panels, we will have a drink reception, and we wouldn't be able to offer that without the support from the Study of Parliament group. So thank you so much for the Study of Parliament group for funding our drinks reception. And on that, I'll pass on to Alex.
As Christina said, it's a delight to have so many of the contributors to this edition of the book in the room with us tonight and watching online. One of the joys of this book is how it's brought together 73 different authors, so 38 academics, 35 parliamentary practitioners who have worked together in combination to produce a book that only their expertise from working in Parliament or studying Parliament together could produce. We're delighted that this book is able to go forward, take that expertise to inform all past, present and future students of Parliament, and we hope you are too.
So my job was to reiterate all the thank yous, and we've had a lot of thank yous. So I'm going to go off script slightly, and I'm going to thank these two who were standing behind me here, because it's really challenging to write a book and bring together so many people, but those two make it really easy, and it's really fun when you're doing something with your best mates. So I'll talk through a little bit about what's going to happen. We've invited some of our chapter authors to talk tonight, and we've chosen them deliberately to kind of span the different sections of the book. So you'll hear from them, and then there'll be a chance to ask them questions, and we look forward to catching up with everybody individually at the drinks reception afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Do you guys want to sit? So you have to stand there. Okay, so I get to introduce our first panel, which comprises Professor Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit at UCL, Dr. Sean Hawkey, who is Senior Lecturer at the University of Liverpool, and Chloe Mawson, who is Clerk Assistant at the House of Lords. So I think we'll, if it's okay with you, Meg, work this way across the panel. And they're each just going to say a few words to introduce their chapter, and then, as I say, we will go to questions. Meg.
Okay,
Thank
terrific.
you.
Thanks, Hannah. And just to continue a theme, I wanted to start by paying tribute to the editors of this book. I just think you've done an amazing job. I have to confess, this is the second edition of the book. The first one came out in 2018. When they announced what they were doing on the first one, I said, you must be bonkers. That's going to be a nightmare to pull together that many authors. But they pulled it off the last time, and they've pulled it off again in an even bigger book with more authors. The first book was incredibly useful and good quality. And this one, I've started to read it. I haven't got through it yet, but there's some fantastic stuff in there. So I just think it is a brilliant thing that you've done for the profession and more widely in producing this book. I'm one of the teachers of the British Parliamentary Studies module, which is sponsored by the UK Parliament, so we do things in cooperation, and it's just a fantastic resource for the students on there. But the way that it's written, I think it's sort of sufficiently simple to be suitable for the general reader who wants to learn about Parliament, but it's also sufficiently sophisticated and detailed that it's suitable for people who actually work with Parliament professionally. So just, it's such a fantastic thing you've done, and there I've used up half my time to say that. But I also wanted to pay tribute. It's rather unfair that I'm here. My brilliant co-author, Dr. Daniel Gover, is sitting at the back. We are the contributors of the chapter on scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny and impact on government bills. We were in the previous edition of the book doing the same. We follow the chapter by Leah Lawrence-Smith, who's here, and co-author, who I'm afraid I forget, on the sort of formal process of the formal legislative process. And we follow up with more the kind of informal dynamics of the politics of how the legislative process works. And Dan and I, in the first edition of the book, drew quite heavily on the study that we'd done that was published in our book in 2017, which was all about the legislative process, which emphasized very much the informal dynamics, the unseen influence, and so on. And so the chapter focuses on things like how not all amendments to government bills are ever meant to be accepted, not all government amendments to bills come from government, they're often responsive to Parliament, how the legislative process is connected to other processes that go on. A lot that goes on in the legislative process is actually not about trying to influence the bill in hand, it's about other stuff, but also there's a lot that goes on in Parliament in things like question time, private members' bills, EDMs, which is aimed at influencing the legislative process. So it's all very connected and complicated. I think, I speak for me, I haven't actually spoken about this with Dan in advance, but I think we face some dilemmas doing the update on this as to whether we could simply repeat the same message that we had in 2018 about the way that there's more influence going on in the process than people tend to assume, and it's a rather positive story, because obviously the book reflects this a lot. Brexit, COVID, Johnson, I would add to Johnson Sunak, who in a piece that I published seemed to have an even worse record on scrutiny than Johnson did. Can we really be so positive as we were last time? We have a case study. After all the chapters have case studies after them. Our case study was on the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. And I think that in doing that case study, we did begin to feel a bit more satisfied that those hidden dynamics were not dead. Actually, there was all sorts going on in that. It was a huge bill subject to masses and masses of amendments. But we saw all of the things that we talked about in our book and in the previous iteration of the chapter. We saw significant government rebellions in the Commons. We saw pressure group involvement in the process. We saw concessions in the House of Lords to things which had been pressed on the government by the opposition front bench at second reading in the House of Commons. And we saw House of Lords defeats which the government conceded on. So actually, The legislative process and influence is not dead, was not dead even under Johnson and Sunak, which is quite nice. We also saw the sort of connections to private members' bills and other things going on in Parliament that we had documented before. The legislative process is very much not a linear process. It's a very complicated and connected process. Parliament is an ever-changing institution, clearly. It went through a lot of change between the first edition and the second edition, not all for the better. And now, no sooner this has come, we'd submitted our chapters, but there's a new Parliament and a new government and an unprecedented number of new members in the House of Commons. So I think we've got to rethink all over again how it's changing, and I guess we're already gearing up for the third edition. But I'm really looking forward to reading everything else in the book, and I think the contributors and particularly the editors have just done an amazing job, so thank you.
Very good. 4 minutes.
I'll take Meg's extra minute.
Okay. Sure.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'll also reiterate my thanks to the editors. I was privileged to be part of this project. I co-authored a chapter with Mark Shepherd and Diana Thurbu, and our chapter was a little bit different in that we were exploring parliaments in the plural rather than in the singular. We were asked to kind of put the UK Parliament in its broader context with reference to the 3 devolved parliaments that it created in 1998. And I think the more we thought about that chapter, the more we became convinced that it was a really good idea, because I think the existence of those parliaments for the past 25 years does facilitate comparison and kind of beg the question, you know, to what extent have things been done differently in those devolved parliaments? And if so, does it matter, or what's the significance of that? And we do that by kind of looking at the 3 core parliamentary functions: representation, lawmaking, and scrutiny. And I'll kind of limit remarks to representation and lawmaking, because I think they're the more interesting parts, and they're the parts that I wrote, partially anyway. The point that we make in the book about representation is an obvious but important one. Representation works and looks very differently at the devolved level, and one of the important reasons for that is because at the devolved level, we use proportional or semi-proportional electoral systems. And that allows us to kind of ask, in the specific UK context, does that create a more diverse legislature that better represents the mood and of the population it presides over? And I think the answer is yes, right? You know, last year, Meg mentioned there, we've just got a new Parliament. Parliament celebrated that it had reached this new high point of 40% female MPs. That happened 20 years ago in Scotland and Wales. You know, that was wee buns. 40% is the low end for Wales. It has never dropped below that. In Northern Ireland, we are a bit lower, but that's kind of in the context of a masculinized post-conflict society where female representation's in the high 30s. I think it would be much lower if we weren't using PR. And where we do use first past the post for our MPs, you know, there's a noticeable gap in terms of female representation at the Westminster level. So I think the devolved parliaments are kind of leading the way in terms of representative diversity. And they're also leading the way in terms of representative or electoral reform, because we're moving even further away from first past the post at the devolved level. We still have an element of first past the post in Scotland and Wales because they use it for their single member constituencies. They use that multi-member proportional. But Wales has decided to abandon that altogether, and they're moving to a purely proportional electoral system in 2026. Now, I think that, you know, that begs the question, is that going to percolate up? Does that mean anything for the UK Parliament? Because we have a Prime Minister now who, before he became Prime Minister, kind of nailed his colours very firmly to the mast of electoral reform. He's not too hot on the idea now, but there are significant number of people in the Labour Party who support electoral reform. And I think more significantly, Reform UK support electoral reform. And I think if they've shown anything in recent weeks, they're very effective in controlling the narrative. And I think that is going to push this Parliament or this government more particularly to kind of confront electoral reform head on and either justify and defend first past the post or take a leaf from the devolved legislatures and start to consider alternatives that are much more proportional. I suppose the other expectation I have of this Parliament, or I suppose it's a hope that relates to what we talked about in the chapter, is we hope in the book that more is done to put meat on the bones of the Sewell Convention. We say in our chapter that up until a couple of years ago, the arrangement that Parliament had with its devolved counterparts, Sewell Convention, legislative consent motions, was working quite well in kind of managing what are very diverse and overlapping spheres of legislative jurisdiction. But that has started to crumble, or at least come under strain in the context of Brexit, whereby, on several occasions, the devolved legislatures withheld consent, and yet Westminster persevered with the legislation. Now, even if that has occurred in the very extraordinary context of Brexit, I do hope, and my co-authors hope as well, that steps are taken in this Parliament to strengthen the Sewell Convention, and I think they're very sensible recommendations that have been made from this place. There was a report a couple of years ago on the Sewell Convention, because I think if that doesn't happen and there are any further breaches, there is a real risk that Parliament is going to kind of undermine the devolution settlement in the UK. And I'll leave it there, if that's okay, Hannah.
Very good, thank you. I just encourage everyone to send in any, if you're online, to send in any questions you may have by Slido. Some people have started to do that. If you don't mind telling us who you are, obviously we do accept anonymous questions, but we're always slightly suspicious of anonymous questions. So if you can tell us who you are, it enables people to understand where you're coming from. Let me hand over to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Hannah. So I also would love to thank the editors. I didn't participate last time. In fact, this was really exciting for me because I have been a House of Lords clerk my entire career, so I've never published anything with my own name on it. Everything I published in a select committee report or the companion standing orders, and it's never anything associated with me. So this was very exciting. The chapter I authored is on scrutiny in the House of Lords. I co-authored it with Rosanna Barry, who's also a House of Lords clerk, who's I don't think able to be here tonight. And it's a chapter that gives an overview of the House, its membership, its powers, its approach to scrutiny of both primary and secondary legislation. There are other chapters in the book that go into much more detail. Ours is a sort of overview chapter. And the summary of the chapter is what you would expect for a chapter about the House of Lords. It talks about the role of a scrutinising chamber, the nature of the non-elected membership and the impact that has on their approach, the fact that there is not an outright government majority and hasn't been, the fact that the way that the procedures in the self-regulating House work means that actually the opposition and backbenchers have quite significant impact if they want to. And that they can also really use time as a weapon, as well as things like government defeats and other things. But the chapter also observes that the House of Lords rarely exercises the full extent of its powers. It operates a really good amount of self-restraint. Christina suggested we reflect on the relevance of our chapter in the current Parliament. Well, our chapter talks about membership of the House of Lords, and unfortunately is a chapter that requires you to do the third edition quite quickly because the Labour manifesto obviously had in it various things about House of Lords membership, including the removal of the hereditary peers, the talk of introducing a mandatory retirement age, introduction of a participation requirement, all things that would really change the nature of House of Lords membership. After the election, the Commons got a bill to remove the hereditaries, not to do the other things, but to remove the hereditaries. That bill is now in the Lords. We've had the committee stage. We're not quite sure when we're going to get the report stage, but it's been really interesting watching it because quite a few members have tabled amendments to reflect the Labour manifesto, so introduce a retirement age, introduce a participation requirement, and the government have had to say, oh, nice idea, but no, not now. This is just a hereditary peers bill. That's caused some controversy. So it's definitely an interesting time for watching the membership of the Lords. And it's not just that we're going to probably lose the hereditary peers. We've also had significant, about 50 new members introduced since the election. We're up to 834 eligible members now. It was 782 a year ago. And I would guess we're going to get more because Labour still have 73 fewer members, than the Conservatives. So not only have we seen a big increase in the overall membership of the House, but the active membership of the House. The new members in the Lords are up and running really quickly. They're tabling amendments, they're speaking, they're heading up questions, and you can really feel it in the House. We are busy, and it will also be really interesting to watch what impact that then has on self-regulation. Can that continue in a really active House? Yeah, I have lots of interesting examples I was going to try to go into around the impact of the House of Lords, but I haven't got a clock in front of me. I feel like that might have been 5 minutes, so I will save those in case there are questions.
Brilliant. Okay, I think I'm going to go pretty quickly to audience questions because I'm sure your questions will be far more interesting than mine. I have had a good question, which, just to warn the panel, I'm going to put to them finally before they get to retreat back into the audience, which is from Joachim von Hallatz, who says, David Judge suggests on page 366 of the book that exploring, that's just a previous Reddit, right? Exploring Parliament does prompt thinking big about Parliament's future. Can the panellists share their ideas about thinking big about Parliament's future? I think this is grounds for all of you to go beyond your chapters and tell us one big idea about Parliament's future. I think I know what Meg's is going to be. But we'll come to that question last. I'm going to now come to the audience in the room. We have a roving microphone. So if you would wait for it to get to you so that the audience online can hear what you say, and if you don't mind introducing yourself before you ask a question so we know who you are, that'd be great. Anyone like to ask a question in the room? Paul. We might take, if there are, 2 or 3 together, and then the panel can pick which ones they want to answer.
Paul Evans, former House of Commons clerk. My question is principally directed to Meg, but not exclusively, which is, it's heartening to hear that bill scrutiny, as you studied it, is not as bad as you feared. But my question is rather, having got that bill through, did it make any difference to the world?
Other questions in the room? Come on. Mark.
Mark Darcy, Parliament Matters podcast. One of the things that strikes me about House of Commons procedure, and must strike everybody really, is it's based on the idea of 2 sides. There's a government and there's an opposition. How would Parliament have to adapt to become more multipolar if after the next election you had 2 potential rival coalitions almost, one on the left and one on the right, battling for control, but each with different views and divergent bits? Because at the moment, the system couldn't accommodate that, I don't think. Not very comfortably, anyway.
Matthew, you look like you might be going to ask a question. Were you itching your nose?
I was actually thinking that's the question I would have asked. And I'd like to hear the answer.
Okay, in which case I'm going to add a 3rd question, which is specifically to Chloe. I'm just interested in her reflections on what Meg was saying around your observations of whether you feel like the legislative process is changing. So we have Paul's question about whether the bill that your case study was on ultimately has made any difference, and I guess there's a wider question about, you could extend that into a wider question about whether we always legislate for good reasons. Then, yes, you all might have something to say about this question about more multipolar procedure from Mark. But start with you, Meg.
That's an impossibly difficult question. If I could throw it to Dan, who probably knows the answer better than I do. I think there are 2 sides of it, aren't there? Did the bill make any difference? And did really the scrutiny in the end make any difference? There were concessions, but did the concessions matter? I think sometimes the process is about sort of arguing to stand still, isn't it? So the rebellion on the bill, which was led by Theresa Villiers, which was about planning and house building, was met with a non-legislative concession from the government, which was all about planning guidance, which I suspect meant that they sort of wound up where they started as a result of battling over that thing. There were other things battled over in the Lords, where there was a fight about nutrient neutrality, which was again about house building. I think it was really an attempt by Conservative backbenchers to try and embarrass Labour into not voting for something that would make Labour look like they were blocking house building. Labour didn't fall for it, but since the election, I think we've heard some grumbles from the Labour Party about nutrient neutrality. So what goes around comes around. A lot of what was in that bill was very detailed local government stuff, and of course we've now got a new government. So in honesty, I can't in proper detail answer your question about what has changed, but very often I think what you're getting at is maybe that there are dozens of clauses and hundreds of amendments, and the sum total of the impact is what? And I'm not sure it would be as great as all of that energy might have suggested, but further than that, I wouldn't like to go.
Sean, I mean, obviously, the devolved parliaments have lots to teach us about how to deal with more diverse oppositions and different structures of government.
I think so. I mean, in Northern Ireland, we're still getting used to the idea of having an opposition. We had one for 6 months, 2016 to 2017, but we've now had an opposition since the institutions were restored. And I think we're making a very good fist of it. What I like about it, and I'll speak mostly about Northern Ireland here because that's my kind of background, is that when you look now at ministerial questions and questions to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, there is more light than heat compared to what you see in Westminster, I think. They're quite boring, and some people don't like that, but they're thick on detail, and I think from an accountability perspective, it's really useful. Watch First Minister's questions. Sometimes if you watch it on YouTube, you can see there's like 9 people watching it. But the answers from both of Emma Little-Pengelly and Michelle O'Neill are often very impressive because there isn't that drama. There aren't the jokes and the jibes. You have to know your onions. You have to know your stuff. And I think from an accountability point of view, that's very good for our democracy.
Chloe, I put that question to you about how the legislative process is or isn't changing. You've worked in the Lords for a while. What are your observations?
I certainly recognise what Meg said around COVID and after COVID. It wasn't just during COVID when we were in hybrid proceedings that you saw a real change and an understandable change because of the technological limitations of what could be done. But that continued after COVID, and it's taken quite a long time to sort of get back into the sort of energy and the sort of previous culture around the scrutiny of legislation. But, you know, I think there are always real live examples where you can see all the features that I think, Meg, you set out as sort of features in a really dynamic legislative process. I mean, just this week in the House of Lords, we've been doing ping-pong with the Commons on the Data Use and Access Bill, and that's a bill that has in it a clause that creates a fence around the creation of deepfake images. That was a clause that the government put in partly after a Lords Private Members Bill that Baroness Owen had tried to get through the Lords. The government hadn't supported at the time. Then parts of that were put into government bill. There was lots of pressure group action and other things. Baroness Owen made a coalition of members across the House of Lords. And just to say, in the House of Lords, we don't just have 2 parties, so we could, we've got some good examples of lots of influential groups. You know, there were government defeats, then there was the working with the government, there was the drafting the final amendments in her name, but with the help of Parliamentary Council. So, you know, you've still got lots of live examples, even that's just this week, of it working. But that's not always how it works. It's a real mixed bag. So.
Great, and I'm going to just put that question I pre-flagged to you. So your big ideas about the future of Parliament. Meg.
Me?
Again, I'm making you go first a lot, I'm sorry.
Well, you think you know what my answer's going to be, so I don't know which one is the obvious answer and how to pick something different now. I think there are 2 things that you might think are the obvious answer coming from me. So maybe I'll try both of them. I mean, one of them is obviously there is the question about the long-term future of the House of Lords. Maybe that's the one you wanted to ascribe to me. Lords reform, I thought, was going I suggested in an IFG report that it should be a two-stage process, do the small stuff first and then leave the big stuff until later because it's harder. Initially, I thought that was what this government was planning. It now seems to have morphed into a three-stage process where you do the hereditary peers first and then maybe you get to the other small stuff and then you get to the big stuff afterwards. So the big stuff, I think, is interesting. Whether there's going to be a public consultation, maybe a citizens' assembly or something on the future of the Lords, that would be really interesting to watch. But the other thing that you and I have spoken about is fundamentally, radically rethinking the legislative process, which I think touches Paul's question about really whether this is the best that we can do, whether actually we shouldn't take the whole thing apart and say, would we start from here? You know, should we, there's as one would expect, a chapter in the book by Ruth Fox and Bridget Fowler of the Hansard Society, or formerly of the Hansard Society, about delegated legislation, which we're all worried about. You know, would we draw the line between primary and delegated legislation where it is now? Should we perhaps be focusing more on parliamentarians debating the details, having the kind of political arguments they're interested in, and do the technical stuff in a slightly different process that might be more expedited? Really big questions around all of that, I think, that would be interesting to explore, and we might do so.
Indeed we might. Sean?
I don't know if I should say this in a room full of Westminster nerds, but I think Parliament should seriously consider, or at least should confront the question of, again, of a devolved Parliament for England. I think there's a real inequity in how the constitutional politics of this state works. That might gut a lot of the functions that Westminster currently exercises. But I think, as our chapter shows, the devolved parliaments are quite cool institutions and are doing some things very well, arguably better than Westminster. So I think that would be a force for good, and I think I would like to see at least a full and frank discussion about it. The other thing is, I think Parliament could do good by embracing in a proactive way the conversation about the Constitution and the kind of integrity of the United Kingdom. Again, from a kind of Northern Ireland perspective, the perception is that the Parliament's approach, successive Parliament's approach, has been one of avoidance. You know, don't talk about it. You know, we don't ask us about what the criteria might be for a border poll, and that does, I think, give fodder to those who want to paint Parliament as a kind of a dishonest broker. You know, they don't want to talk about this thing, so we need to mobilise. You know, we need to push towards this kind of breakup of the United Kingdom. I think one of the ways that could be dealt with in a more proactive way would be to have that conversation.
Great. Zoe?
I find this a really difficult question, because I think if you have been a clerk for your entire career, thinking big and radically about reform is really difficult, and obviously...
you need to leave and run a think tank.
And then it's even more difficult because then Meg talked about Lord's reform, and it's the one thing I get to talk about. So it is quite a hard one to answer. I mean, I quite liked it, just on Lord's reform, when people were talking about some really different approaches. I'm not saying this is the right approach, but there was all the debate about why don't we take the second chamber outside of London? Why don't we even make it, there were huge practical problems here, but even make it peripatetic, and so that it's moving around and engaging different parts of the country. And, you know, I think that thinking a bit more radically about roles of second chambers and how they can be distinct from the lower house would be an exciting thing to do.
Great. I think that's a very interesting set of ideas. Can I ask you to join me in thanking this mini panel? And then, if you would like to exit. And I can introduce my second panel. It's not often I get to have two panels in one event. It's very exciting. So we have, you're going to have to sit in Chloe's chair. So we have Professor Nicholas Allen, who is Professor of Politics at Royal Holloway. We have my excellent colleague, Rebecca McKee, who is Senior Researcher here at the IFG, although latterly worked with Meg at the Constitution Unit, and Margaret McKinnon, who is Director, Member and Members Staff Services Team at the House of Commons. Rebecca, I'm going to make you start, seeing you're sitting in the starting chair.
Great,
Bad luck.
thank you. I will caveat with the fact that this research was a project based on a project that I did several years ago when I was working for Meg at the Constitution Unit. So diving back into my thoughts of that earlier was very nostalgic, and I really enjoyed it, but I'll try and remember as much as possible. I wrote this chapter with Matthew Congreve, and we wrote it. It's called Supporting Members and Peers, and it sits within the People and Places in Parliament part of the book. We were both new authors on this section. I think that there was a desire to kind of focus a little bit more on MP staff, which was the project that I had done before, and Matthew works in Parliament as well, which I think is, again, when we talk about like what's the difference between maybe the first and the second edition of the book, I think really highlights the greater attention that has been placed on the staff that help to support MPs, either their personal staff or people that work in Parliament, and kind of like just recognition of the critical role that they play. I do feel like that has really come to the fore and has been really excellent. So yes, this chapter kind of explores this critical yet often unexamined group of people, or different groups of people, the landscape of support that enables MPs and peers to fulfil their kind of wide-ranging roles that they have. So that's from supporting them with research on debates and also on committee work, but also for MPs on the kind of growing constituency work and responsibilities and comms, various things like that they're doing. So members of both houses can receive support from personal staff, and then obviously there's the various in-house parliamentary services. This chapter primarily focuses on MP staff and then those house services. We wrote it together, but I wrote the bit on MP staff, and it's a bit I'm super interested in, so I will also use this platform to talk a little bit more about that. But I will say that there's three key findings that we kind of try and bring out in this chapter across the whole landscape. And the first one is that the support comes from a range of different sources. So that's firstly the personal staff. So primarily for MPs, this is funded through IPSA, but also short money, and it's possible to fund them through other means as well. So each MP gets a staffing allowance. That funds, I think it's still at around 5 full-time equivalent members of staff, but that can vary between having 1, 2 people up to, I think, when I looked at the data, one MP had 11 staff at one time, all on like part-time contracts, which is, I don't know how you manage that. That feels like an awful lot. And they're split into kind of formal roles, although obviously in practice there's a lot of blurring the lines between the kind of roles, which is like research, handling casework, supporting administrative work and office management, but also kind of doing anything and everything that an MP will do. As part of my research that I drew on for this, I surveyed MP staff, and I asked them about the kind of the various roles that they were fulfilling, and in part I asked them how often they were doing kind of personal errands, not really expecting quite a big answer, and I think it was something like around 20% of people said that was like a normal part of their job to kind of run personal errands for the MP. It's not in the IPSA job description, of course. There's around 3,500 of these staff at any one time who are based in Westminster and across the constituencies. And what's interesting about them is that they're employed by the MP themselves, not by Parliament. So they have this kind of unique role compared to their kind of counterparts who are employed by Parliament or kind of other people that they're interacting with. And peers, they don't receive an equivalent staffing support, but they often or sometimes do employ aides as well, but that's kind of privately funded and there's far fewer, which also means there's less data on it, so I didn't look at it, but it is still an interesting area. There's also the pooled party services, and also members that sit on committees, they receive obviously support from officials, clerks. And then there's various offices such as the table office, journal office, which provide kind of advice and guidance on procedure. And then there's other support, of course, from the House Libraries, Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, Parliamentary Digital Service, and I'm going to just put an etc. there before I try and exhaustively list everybody and inevitably leave somebody out. The second key finding is that demand for support is rising. So the number of staff working directly for MPs has grown significantly. From 1999 to 2023, when I was looking at it, staffing numbers increased by 78%. And the vast majority of MPs use the vast majority of their staffing allowance. So as the staffing allowance has increased over time, they're filling their staffing allowance by employing new people, and having done interviews and speaking to people working in MPs' offices and MPs themselves, there is that demand. There's no shortage of work. Obviously, it varies between different constituencies as well. And the third point is that support is fragmented. So one of the things that I really came out of this research is that there's just little strategic oversight of the kind of support that MPs are receiving, and that's really down to there being no one body responsible for the whole part of it. IPSA gained responsibility for MP staff after the expenses scandal, and kind of by default as an expense, staff went to IPSA, and there has been some discussion a couple of times about whether to bring that in-house and how to manage that, but that's how it still remains. And increases in the allowances tended to be kind of ad hoc. So it's basically when there's been enough critical mass of calls for changes and increases to the allowances, although now that IPSA has that is a bit more strategic. And the Speakers Conference, which is the case study that I use in the book, did take a look at that, but again, it's quite difficult. That's a kind of consensus model of MPs themselves making that decision, but there's a real lack of that kind of, I guess, organisational oversight that many of us will be familiar with in kind of organisations outside of Parliament that we work in or others work in. That really kind of came out from the research.
Great, thank you. Nicholas.
Okay, thank you. So I was one of the newbie authors for this edition of Exploring Parliament, and I'd like to thank the editors for inviting me. Whether I get invited for the third edition remains to be seen. So my chapter is on MPs and their constituencies. It was co-authored with Emma Salisbury, who really led on much the best part of the chapter, which was a case study, or is a case study, of a hypothetical case that needs to be dealt with by an MP, so personal problems that the MP needs to help deal with. Whereas Emma was drawing on very extensive personal experience and expertise as a caseworker in Parliament, I was really primarily drawing on my experience as a teacher of parliamentary studies, the parliamentary studies module that the book speaks to really so very well. And with that in mind, I suppose what I wanted to do in this chapter was to emphasize just how much the constituency frames and cuts across what happens in the House of Commons. For many people, it's a source of distraction. And I'm sure you're all aware of people who think MPs should be doing other things rather than pandering to their constituents. Some MPs may feel the same. But of course, for a very large number of MPs, it's also an enormous source of satisfaction, getting to help people, improving their lives, being this almost helper of last resort. So it was sort of very much as a teacher that I was approaching the structure and organisation of this chapter. And it begins with sort of the constitutional dimension, and in particular the sort of tradition of constituency representation, which is just almost taken for granted, but is so deeply embedded in most people's understandings of some of the most important understandings and rules of how the British political system works. I mean, we heard about devolution in the last panel, but there is, it's very difficult. Even to get some of my students, I try to badger them to be a little bit more open-minded and progressive, think about change. Very difficult to get them to just let go of the idea that somehow places ought to be represented. Very difficult. And whether that proves to be an obstacle for electoral reform, I think time will tell. The second part then looks at the electoral dimension. So how MPs are, how they get to Westminster. And I'll be upfront at this point, when I was writing this section of the chapter, I was very mindful of a friend and colleague who's now the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath, because being friends of him on Facebook, I just watched how he became this almost like shadow member of Parliament. Ever since he was first selected as a Lib Dem candidate, the amount of information he was putting out on social media for his prospective constituents was really remarkable. And it that was very much in mind as I wrote that part. The third section then looks at MPs in their constituencies, and of course, compared with 100 years ago, they spend much more time in their constituencies, meeting constituents, holding surgeries, and so on. And then the fourth and final part, again, just sort of bringing into play and trying to emphasize just how the constituency frames and cuts across what happens at Westminster, was the constituency in Parliament. I'm sure many of you are aware of some of the gratuitous early day motions that MPs table and support to sort of promote their constituency. That's, of course, one part of it. But the constituency is present in Parliament in Westminster in many other ways. MPs ask questions on the floor of the House. They meet their constituents, often in person, perhaps increasingly online. So it sort of really seeps into their time there. And then in the case study, which was really just trying to sort of showcase how MPs may end up performing, as I said something at the beginning, this sort of helper of last resort in the system. And in that, and Emma took the lead, it just sort of really emphasises the myriad challenges that might confront an MP. And I suppose also just at the end of the day, so much of what they do to help their constituents really rests on their soft power. It's not like they have any kind of executive authority in their constituency. It's really a case of using what they can that attaches to their status to help them. Okay, finally, in terms of the current Parliament, because like everyone else, we wrote this before the dissolution occurred. One obvious question to think about, of course, is how the influx of so many new members might change sort of the constituency relationship, how they might experience it. But I suppose above all, in terms of contemporary politics, there's kind of the 3 M's that I'm mindful of. One, of course, is Labour's very large majority, lots of MPs sitting on their hands, at least in terms of perhaps scrutinising the government, multipartism, and marginality. And changes in the voting system, the strange outcome of the last election, I mean, it could really affect and perhaps increase even more, I suppose, the importance of the constituency as a motivator of MPs' behaviour.
Very interesting. Thank you. Margaret.
Thank you. I'd actually like to start with an apology. I'm on the tail end of a cold, so I'm sorry for my croaky voice and like overall disgustingness. I'd then also like to thank the editors. I've never been on a panel for a book launch or sat in a green room, so it's extremely exciting for me. And also to thank my co-authors, who really were the authors of our chapter on challenges facing MPs, Stephanie Raher and James Weinberg, who they were just such a pleasure to get to know. I hadn't met either of them before, and it was really fascinating learning more about their kind of fields of work, which are just as relevant for the 2024 Parliament as the Parliaments came before. So you'll be relieved to hear this is not necessarily a chapter that is so ready for a kind of 3rd edition. I'm very lucky in my current job, if that's the right way to put it, being in a team called the Members and Member Staff Services team, in that we see sort of lots of different angles of an MP's lives and the lives of their staff, actually. So we see a lot of the kind of different challenges they face, which as a clerk, I think I saw one bit, and this is far more varied. But thinking ahead of this event about the things that are most relevant, there are just 2 things I'm going to pick out, although this subject could fill many textbooks, and I think is a subject of a lot of really good papers. The first is on security, and it's something we pulled out in the chapter as a sort of what's called in the chapter a micro level or individual stressor for members, and it feels like a sort of ever-growing challenge and an ever-growing problem. And we sort of think about security often from a sort of personal security perspective, like having security devices and threats, and we've had really terrible murders of members in the time that I've worked in Parliament. But there are also lots of ways in which it's really pervasive in their lives and the lives of their staff. I mean, right down to things like struggling to get buildings and contents insurance for their constituency offices and even their homes, and the impact on their families. And watching the new intake come in last year, and kind of all the conversations they then started to have to start having with the security team about this aspect now of their lives has been quite difficult to see. There's a new speakers conference on security of MPs and candidates, which we'll report this year, and I think it will be really interesting to see the recommendations coming from that. The second thing I'd like to pull out is, in the chapter we focused on a couple of different groups, and one of them was disabled MPs. And this is an area that I think and I hope will be one of sort of real progress for this Parliament.
We don't in Parliament collect diversity data on MPs. They're not our employees. But just through MPs that have spoken about their experiences, this might be the Parliament that has the highest number of disabled MPs in it. It's an area that the Modernisation Committee have chosen to look at. They have a work stream on it. And if anybody is interested in this area, on the 1st of April, a group of disabled MPs gave evidence to the committee. It's a really, really fascinating watch, so do look at it. I would really encourage anybody who's interested in this area, and it's really complicated. It's complicated for anybody working in Westminster. But if you're an MP, it's sort of got this extra layer of you're not an employee, so there's not kind of one person to go to talk about what you might need and what adjustments might need to be made. And in my team, we're sort of trying to work now with the health and wellbeing team and with members so that they can understand that sort of patchwork of who they might need to speak to about the physical estate, who they might need to speak to about digital equipment. If you need adjustments in the chamber, that's a different decision maker. It is if you're in a select committee. It is if you're you need to talk about your working hours and you have to have that conversation with your whip. So I think it's a really fascinating area and one which is long overdue some real scrutiny, and one where I hope we can make some progress.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Okay, we only have 7 minutes before we have to go and have drinks, which is compulsory. So I'm going to take one round of questions. I've got one online, but do we have more than one online, but one that I particularly want to ask? Any questions in the room?
Nobody else.
Anyone going to relieve Paul of the responsibility of asking a question? No? Okay, Paul.
Across the fields you've researched, particularly supporter members in all its dimensions, did you detect any difference between MPs representing constituencies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland who have another set of representatives competing for attention in those constituencies and those representing constituencies in England?
Very interesting. And then I've got a couple of questions. Oh, Christina's got a question. Here you go.
It's not a question, it's just a cheeky point of information that obviously we've had 6 amazing panellists here talking over their chapters, and I hope everyone is really, really interested in that. But just point out that the book has 33 chapters, so there's many other topics that it covers, and it would have been impossible to represent them all. And so I'm really thankful for the panellists to be here, but just point out there's other chapters, and including 2 excellent chapters on the diversity of members and on women in the House of Commons, where the authors are here. That does include the 2024 Parliament's election, which was, you know, hard work as you can imagine, but it does include that. And we have tried to thread in elements of the 24 election throughout the other chapters where relevant. So it's just a cheeky point of information. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just going to put one more other question in then so that we finish on time. This is a question from Mark. Parliament has dealt with significant challenges to its own ways of working recently, Brexit and COVID. Have they had long-term impacts on the way Parliament works? What is the next likely big challenge that may affect how Parliament works? Okay, so we've got a question from Paul on whether there's a difference for members who have other members representing their area because they're in a devolved area, and then I'm really interested to hear all of your thoughts on what the next big challenge might be for ways of working in Parliament.
I can go first. So on the devolved question, yes, I thought there was some kind of interesting observations. And again, I don't know how exactly it works now, but this is when I was looking at staff a couple of years ago. But for example, in the MPs that were based up in Scotland, where they were of the same party as the MSPs, there was a lot of shared offices, lots of shared staff, that kind of part-time roles and stuff, which I think worked really well. I actually did a placement in one of those MPs' offices, and what I thought was quite interesting is the way they used the pooled staffing arrangement. So they put a lot more emphasis into their kind of pooled staffing arrangements of staff in Westminster and drew on them a lot more. And that was kind of in order to not have staff travelling down all the time from Scotland down to London, for example. So a lot more of them will actually be based up in Scotland in the constituency offices for more of the time, which you can imagine where some of those constituencies are is just very welcome, I'm sure, for many of those staff. Also in Northern Ireland, again, office sharing, staff sharing and things like that. I can't remember any insights from Wales, but potentially the same. Yeah.
And your challenge?
Oh, my challenge? I was going to take another second for that, but I'll tell you what I wrote down really quickly, which is going back to my other interest in Parliament is around public engagement. And I think a real challenge for Parliament is how to meet the expectations of public engagement and involvement in a kind of modern way. We're doing, my colleagues are doing a little bit of work, for example, at the moment on hybrid bill procedure, which again, Paul knows because we spoke to him. We're looking at that kind of petition process and the kind of difference in that petition process versus the other petition process. And actually, what are the public's experience when they're facing and interacting with Parliament? And there's, going to be newer types of online technology tools that can kind of help that. But I think how you actually meet those expectations in a meaningful way that's a good experience for the public and the user, I think is going to be a challenge and really needs thinking through for all the different aspects of how Parliament engages with the public. Wasn't too bad considering I was going to take another minute.
Yes, shameless plug for our work on hybrid bills. If anyone has views on hybrid bills, come and see us. Nicholas.
Challenge.
Challenge.
A reform UK majority, I suspect.
And
don't know how likely it is.
I mean, in terms of, do you think that's going to affect how it is to work in Parliament? Because I guess the question for Mark was focusing around sort of working practices, the effect of COVID and Brexit and so on. Do you think that is going to... it will definitely affect the politics.
I imagine it would affect the politics depending, be very careful what I say, depending on the characters and individuals who are elected. It could well affect other aspects of everyday life in Parliament for everyone who works there. The reversal of some initiatives, perhaps. So I could see it being a bit of a challenge.
Great. Oh, good.
I think with COVID, we saw a lot of measures in the House of Commons, some which were retained in the House of Lords, that made it a bit easier for members to use their time more efficiently and to know what was going to happen in the chamber and be more prepared for it. And I do wonder whether the 2024 intake, their expectations of Parliament as a kind of workplace, even though they're not employees, will be, can we bring any of that efficiency back? Because they're so time poor and there's so much pressure on their time that, I think being able to use their time most effectively is something that they may be interested in.
I would like to add, this is probably the only panel I've done recently where I've asked a question of that nature and no one's mentioned the letters AI, but maybe something of what you're getting at there, Margaret, might point in that direction. In a moment, I'm just going to ask you to thank this excellent panel, but before I finish, I'm going to finish with a question that's come in, which is one I think that everyone in the audience should think about, but you don't necessarily have to answer straight away. Question from Julia Cushion from My Society. This book does a fantastic job in explaining how Parliament works. Thanks to all the authors. What should Parliament as an institution do to help ordinary people understand what happens there? I think it's probably one we should all, as parliamentary nerds, reflect on. But do join me in thanking everyone and thanking... Thanks to the editors and thanks to everyone, the team at the RFG, for helping run this event.